All right, let's start this one with a little video demo. All you've got to do is watch what happens in this old video from another university's campus. Are you ready? Holy crap. It turns out that guy planted a bomb, and you were the only eyewitness who saw him. Do you think you could identify the bomber in a police lineup? Let's try. The 6 men that you're about to see will go by quickly, so pay attention and do your best to find the bomber. All right, were you able to identify the bomber? Which number was it? I'll give you the answer shortly, but this is surprisingly hard and most people don't get it right, even though you literally just saw the perp's face moments beforehand. And that's because our memory isn't perfect, especially if we didn't attend closely to the details of something like a specific face. Now imagine how much worse our accuracy might be when more time has passed, especially if we're asked leading questions, like by an interviewer or a police officer, or getting mixed information from other witnesses. This can be a more subtle problem than you think. Like, even if a police interviewer is well trained and careful to not bias your choice from the lineup, some really problematic issues can happen after the lineup. So for example, imagine after you point to the man who you think it is, that the officer who's interviewing you says, "Good, you identified the suspect." Like, would that make you more confident in your judgment? Probably. In fact, there's a 2003 article by Wells and colleagues that showed this kind of post-identification feedback by the police officer makes eyewitnesses feel much more confident in their memory, so that when they're later in court and testifying, they become way more certain that the person they picked out is the person they witnessed originally. Way more certain than they were when they first looked at the lineup. The problem is, if we happen to have 6 innocent people in the lineup and the real suspect isn't there, then whoever the witness happens to pick in the lineup is going to start to seem more and more like the criminal they witnessed, simply by, such things as pointing them out or getting feedback from the cop that, yeah, that's our suspect. Not the criminal, the cops don't know that yet, but the suspect. And by the way, in that video you just saw, none of the 6 men in the lineup were the man from the original video who planted the bomb. But if I told you your lineup choice when you made your choice, if I told you, yeah, that was the suspect, your confidence in your choice and in your memory increases, which is kind of scary when you think about it, especially since the United States Supreme Court has held that judges in trials should consider confidence of the eyewitness as the primary factor in deciding whether the identification is accurate. That's literally the law on eyewitness testimony. Which is why if you ask people whether the testimony of one confident eyewitness should be enough evidence to convict someone of a crime, the general public is pretty mixed on that issue, but experts pretty much unanimously strongly disagree with that statement. Partly that's because of work over the past couple of decades by cognitive psychologists showing how flawed our memories can be, especially when we're intentionally or unintentionally exposed to misinformation. And this is actually called the misinformation effect, where exposure to incorrect information can kind of go back and retroactively change our memories. Our memories are already imperfect. We know that. We know from the way perception and attention work and the way sensory memory works that we just don't capture and accurately store all the information that we see or hear, but only limited parts of it, especially the bits we attend to. But It's not just that our memory is limited, but that we often don't recognize when it has changed details or added in false elements. So one example of the misinformation effect shows up in like a 2007 study where they showed a photoshopped version of some famous historical picture, like for example, the classic Tiananmen Square image of a man standing in front of tanks after the student protests. The original image had no crowd, but in this study, some people saw the Photoshop version with the crowd photoshopped in, and for those people, it changed how they remembered the event. Or in this 2009 study where they brought participants into a lab, kind of showed how easy it is to get someone to remember an event that never happened, even from their own life. So specifically during an interview, participants came in for an interview, they were asked to vividly imagine a fake event from their own childhood. And later on, after some time had passed, their brains started to remember that as real. So for example, the person came in for their first session, their first interview, and the researchers had photoshopped a real childhood photo of them and a family member that was with them, and photoshopped that onto a hot air balloon photo. So it's a totally fake event. The person never went on a balloon as a child. But in the interview, they were then asked some leading questions like this. So they don't know that this is a fake image. They think it's an image that I think they got in touch with their family member and got an image from them. And they're told that this is a real image from the family member. Okay. So in the interview, the subject might say, no, never actually thought I'd been in a hot air balloon. So there we go. And the interviewer asks, you can't remember anything about this event? The subject says, nah, though it is me. Like they can see in the image, like, yeah, that looks like me. No memory whatsoever. And the interviewer says, well, if you want to take a few minutes and concentrate on getting a memory back, something about the event. And the subject's like, no, I honestly, no, I can't. That's really annoying. But then the interview asks the subject to just imagine what could have happened, simply to vividly imagine what it would have been like, even though they didn't remember this happening, right? It's a totally made up event. Days later, the same participant, they brought them back into the laboratory for a final interview, and the interviewer asks, okay, tell me everything you can recall about event 3, in this case, the balloon event, without leaving anything out. So there were other real events and real photographs that weren't altered in any way, but event 3, the balloon one, happened to be the fake one that they put in this particular deception study. Okay, and at this point, you get responses like this, where the subject says, just trying to work out how old my sister was, trying to get the exact when it happened, but I'm still pretty certain it occurred when I was in Form 1, so that's 6th grade, at the local school there. Basically for $10 or something, you could go up in a hot air balloon, go up about 20 odd meters. It would have been a Saturday, and I think we went with, parents, and no, it wasn't, not my grandmother, not certain who any of the other people are there. And I'm pretty certain that mom is down there on the ground taking a photo. Like, this is the same person that days earlier did not remember ever having been in a hot air balloon as a kid, because of course they never were. But now they're saying they remember those details, despite it being a trick and a totally made up false event. In fact, countless studies like this have helped us understand how things went so wonky during like the satanic panic of the 1980s and early 90s, when a handful of the same few therapists claimed that they could recover repressed memories of ritual abuse. So they tricked these kids into falsely remembering abuse that had never happened. Just because their so-called recovered memory therapy involved inducing a suggestive state and then making the kids invent details of what might have happened and basically tricking the kids into thinking they'd been abused via these coercive interviews, which is really messed up when you think about it. When you consider how this kind of bullshit repressed memory pseudoscience stuff actually made it harder for real child abuse victims in the future. Because in these cases back in the 80s, it was this handful of crank therapists that were injecting false memories using hypnosis and other suggestive techniques, the same way we now know police might accidentally inject false memories prior to the modern training we now use during interrogations that tries to at least minimize that stuff with better procedures. Like, we have to be careful because it's surprisingly easy to trick a brain into remembering an event that never happened or adding in things that weren't originally there. But our memory will feel just like a real memory. It feels just as genuine. So when we look at our own memories, when we think about how confident we are in our own memories, how real they feel, how vivid they are, we're not always right. And that is not always a signal that the memory is true or that all elements of it are true. Turns out false memories are incredibly common and often hard to detect, especially by the feel of it alone. So part of this is because the way memory works, we don't remember, we don't store all the details of events or exactly how things happen. We don't record all the detailed stuff. What our brain does, it stores the gist of things, the rough outline. Some important bits get stored, and then the rest we kind of fill in after the fact. So we've just stored the general meaning of most things when we go about storing stuff in the brain. Then what happens is our brain reconstructs the memory later. It invents and inserts details that we might expect to fit in this sort of outline, to fit in this sort of schema. So much like perception, our memory is constructive, with the brain filling in the blanks rather than, objectively reporting just the facts. Now, let's switch gears a little and talk about a different kind of memory study. This is a laboratory paradigm developed by Roediger and McDermott back in the 90s. Really famous classic study. So we're going to demo the procedure, which requires you grabbing a pen and paper. So pause the video if you need to go grab a pen and paper. Okay, the procedure is really simple. It'll be pretty quick here. You're just going to see some words come up on the screen one at a time, and you just try and remember as many as you can. At the end, when you're prompted, you'll just write down as many of the words as you can remember in whatever order you want. So we've done something like this before. Okay, ready? Here we go. Okay, pause the video and write down the words you saw. Okay, so pause the video and write them down if you haven't already. We're going to move on. Let's see how many you got right. So these are the words. If you want to pause and check, you can, but I'm actually not that worried about your accuracy. So it's not about counting how many of the words you got right in this case. Instead, I want you to pay attention to the theme in all these words. You probably noticed something related to all of these, which is the concept of sleep. And that's the case even though the word sleep wasn't on the list. And yet you may have written down the word sleep. Some people do, some people don't, but it is really common for people to add that word onto their list afterward, to add that word and think it was in the list, even though it wasn't, which is kind of false memory itself. So the procedure of Roediger and McDermott's paradigm, their classic study, is to show a series of related words to the participant and then ask them to recall the words later, like a normal memory test. So all the words relate to some non-presented, what they call the lure word, like sleep in our example, a word that relates to everything but wasn't there. In another one, all the words might relate to food or something like that, but the word food isn't actually in there. And the results, when they do things like this, participants tend to recall the lure word, the word that wasn't on the list, about as often as the words that are actually presented. In fact, up to half of people are super confident that they saw the lure word, like sleep in our case. So memory can be inaccurate even when we're confident of it. And we see again that it is surprisingly easy to create these simple false memories. One hypothesis is that this false memory might be due to spreading activation of those neurons that encode our semantic network. Like all of the real words that were on the list, they spread activation to the nearby lure word because it's so closely related in our brain, in our semantic network, in our schemas. So the lure word or the lure concept gets kind of indirectly but very strongly activated during the encoding phase when we're exposed to those words, which means we later remember seeing it. The brain invents a memory of seeing it. It must have been on the list because it feels just as familiar and just as recently active as those other words that were directly activated. So that's the Roediger and McDermott study. By the way, this is why if someone spends decades telling the same fake story at the bar to sound really interesting, eventually they start believing their own story and start to mix up which details were genuine and which were embellished. And as we know from reconsolidation research, anytime that we recall or process a memory, we have the potential to alter it. We construct and reconstruct our memories every time we replay them, and each is an opportunity for more little errors to slip in. And this stuff has real-world consequences, as you're going to see in this next video clip I want to share. So this is the start of a TED Talk by cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. She has studied the misinformation effect and false memories for decades now. We're going to watch just the first 8 or 9 minutes of her TED Talk. So let's get that started.
I'd like to tell you about a legal case that I worked on involving a man named Steve Titus. Titus was a restaurant manager. He was 31 years old. He lived in Seattle, Washington. He was engaged to Gretchen, about to be married. She was the love of his life. And one night, the couple went out for a romantic restaurant meal. They were on their way home, and they were pulled over by a police officer. You see, Titus's car sort of resembled a car that was driven earlier in the evening by a man who raped a female hitchhiker. And Titus kind of resembled that rapist. So the police took a picture of Titus. They put it in a photo lineup. They later showed it to the victim, and she pointed to Titus's photo. She said, "That one's the closest." The police and the prosecution proceeded with a trial, and when Steve Titus was put on trial for rape, the rape victim got on the stand and said, "I'm absolutely positive that's the man." And Titus was convicted. He proclaimed his innocence. His family screamed at the jury. His fiancée collapsed on the floor sobbing, and Titus is taken away to jail. So what would you do at this point? What would you do? Well, Titus lost complete faith in the legal system, and yet he got an idea. He called up the local newspaper. He got the interest of an investigative journalist, and that journalist actually found the real rapist, a man who ultimately confessed to this rape, a man who was thought to have committed 50 rapes in that area, and when this information was given to the judge set Titus free. And really, that's where this case should have ended. It should have been over. Titus should have thought of this as a horrible year, a year of accusation and trial, but over. It didn't end that way. Titus was so bitter, he'd lost his job, he couldn't get it back. He lost his fiancée, she couldn't put up with his persistent anger. He lost his entire savings, and so he decided to file a lawsuit against the police and others whom he felt were responsible for his suffering. And that's when I really started working on this case, trying to figure out how did that victim go from "that one's the closest" to "I'm absolutely positive that's the guy." Well, Titus was consumed with his civil case as he spent every waking moment thinking about it, and just days before he was to have his day in court, he woke up in the morning, doubled over in pain, and died of a stress-related heart attack. He was 35 years old. So I was asked to work on Titus's case because I'm a psychological scientist. I study memory. I've studied memory for decades. And if I meet somebody on an airplane This happened on the way over to Scotland. If I meet somebody on an airplane and we ask each other, what do you do, what do you do? And I say, I study memory. They usually want to tell me how they have trouble remembering names, or they've got a relative who's got Alzheimer's or some kind of memory problem. But I have to tell them, I don't study when people forget. I study the opposite, when they remember. When they remember things that didn't happen, or remember things that were different from the way they really were. I study false memories. Unhappily, Steve Titus is not the only person to be convicted based on somebody's false memory. In one project in the United States, information has been gathered on 300 innocent people, 300 defendants who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 10, 20, 30 years in prison for these crimes, and now DNA testing has proven that they're actually innocent. And when those cases have been analyzed, 3/4 of them are due to faulty memory, faulty eyewitness memory. Well, why? Like the jurors who convicted those innocent people, and the jurors who convicted Titus, many people believe that memory works like a recording device. You just record the information, then you call it up and play it back when you want to answer questions or identify images. But decades of work in psychology has shown that this just isn't true. Our memories are constructive. They're reconstructive. Memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it, but so can other people. I first started studying this constructive memory process in the 1970s. I did my experiments that involved showing people simulated crimes and accidents and asking them questions about what they remember. In one study, we showed people a simulated accident, and we asked people how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And we asked other people how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And if we asked the leading smash question, the witnesses told us the cars were going faster. And moreover, that leading smashed question caused people to be more likely to tell us that they saw broken glass in the accident scene when there wasn't any broken glass at all. In another study, we showed a simulated accident where a car went through an intersection with a stop sign, and if we asked a question that insinuated it was a yield sign, many witnesses told us they remember seeing a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. And you might be thinking, well, you know, these are filmed events, they're not particularly stressful. Would the same kind of mistakes be made with a really stressful event? In a study we published just a few months ago, we have an answer to this question. Because what was unusual about this study is we arranged for people to have a very stressful experience. The subjects in the study were members of the US military who were undergoing a harrowing training exercise to teach them what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. And as part of this training exercise, these soldiers are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive fashion for 30 minutes. And later on, they have to try to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And when we feed them suggestive information that insinuates it's a different person, many of them misidentify their interrogator, often identifying someone who doesn't even remotely resemble the real interrogator. And so what these studies are showing is that when you feed people misinformation about some experience that they may have had, you can distort or contaminate or change their memory. Well, out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation not only if we're questioned in a leading way, but if we talk to other witnesses who might consciously or inadvertently feed us some erroneous information, or if we see media coverage about some event we might have experienced. All of these provide the opportunity for this kind of contamination of our memory.
All right, we'll stop that one there, but there's more to her TED Talk online if you're interested. She's actually given a lot of talks you can find online, but you get the gist of it. Over and over again, research shows that our memory is labile. It's imperfect. It's susceptible to errors and alterations. Most of them are completely unintentional, but also there are often things that we're completely unaware of. So we don't realize when misinformation has added these errors into our memories. Finally, there's one last area of memory that I want to address since it's a topic with a lot of misinformation where people often assume that we have more accurate memory than we really do. And that's something called flashbulb memories. So if you've never heard of the term, flashbulb memories are memories of really important events that are experienced almost as vividly. The memory itself is experienced almost as vividly as if the event was captured on video. Like when 9/11 happened back in 2001, years later, people would ask, where were you when September 11th happened? And people would give these vivid, detailed stories of what they were doing when the historical event occurred. So researchers have investigated these types of memories, flashbulb memories, to see why they seem to differ from everyday normal episodic memory. And by the way, it's not just for 9/11, but memory studies have been done on the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion when it blew up and the astronauts died, the O.J. Simpson verdict, Michael Jackson's death, for big fans of his, and other events where people report like a vivid snapshot memory of the events and feel like that memory is super, super accurate. Now, some things we know. Flashbulb memories are more likely to be formed if it's an important event or a historical event or something like that, if it's surprising, and if the event has an emotional effect on you. So people who don't give a crap about Michael Jackson's music aren't going to have a flashbulb memory of when they learned he died, but the diehard fans, they may. Now the scientific question is, are flashbulb memories a genuinely different memory mechanism? Or is it just like, I don't know, a memory that's been rehearsed more because you think about it more often, or it's brought up more often in the days since it happened? Like maybe that's why people have these vivid memories of something like 9/11, because it was talked about nonstop for months afterward, and that caused a sort of rehearsal over and over again, bringing the memory to mind over and over. So in one study, looking at this after the fact, participants wrote down their memory shortly afterwards. They wrote down their memory of the 9/11 attacks and everyday life events that happened in the days like just before those attacks. And then their memory was tested later on. So they were tested 1 week later, 6 weeks later, or 32 weeks later about these memories that they had written down right after the fact. And there was no difference between the 9/11 memories and the everyday memories in terms of how many details they remembered, but also in terms of how accurate the memory was. So people had these flashbulb memories of the attack, not the random everyday life events, and yet their brain wasn't any more accurate about the 9/11 attack than it was of everyday things. What we know now is perceptually rich memories, they give us more confidence. Our confidence is higher when our memory is vivid, but it turns out not more accurate necessarily compared to other memories. So vivid memory does not mean accurate memory, which means we're not always the best judges of whether our memory is right. Indeed, some research in 2003 makes it clear flashbulb memories can be false memories despite how confident people are that they're real due to the vividness. So just for example, 70% of people who were not in New York during the attacks, they reported vivid memory of watching the plane hit the first tower as it happened, like watching on TV as the plane hit the first tower live. But the thing is, there wasn't any live footage. That footage wasn't available until the next day, September 12th. So that's literally impossible that they could have watched it happening live. They mixed up the memories they did have with that later seen footage of the first plane. And this is just the misinformation effect all over again. Once they later saw that day-old video of the first plane hitting the tower, they just integrated that into their vivid memory of the day itself. And now they have a vivid memory of watching the plane strike live, even though that's impossible for the first plane for anyone who was not in New York that day. So the big takeaway lesson from all this false memory stuff, is that all of our memory really is constructive. it's fragile, and it's fallible to some extent. When we recall something that happened, even if it's really vivid to us, our brain is actively constructing kind of its best guess, and it's often filling in the blanks. And this isn't just for eyewitness testimony or major historical events. This is happening all day, every day with your memories. Indeed, simply saying that something happened increases the chance you start to think it did happen, even if it didn't. So for example, in one classic study, subjects watched a video of two brothers at summer camp. So just watching this video, the two brothers interacting at summer camp. Then they're asked a series of questions. And in the questions, some of the questions were about a true event, something that did happen in the video. And some, they were asked questions about a false event, something that didn't even happen in the video. Now here's the trick. There were two conditions. So the subjects were randomly assigned to one of these two conditions. In one condition, the subjects were forced to answer all of the questions, even if it involved guessing. In other words, they had to answer the questions about the event that didn't actually happen in the video. In the other condition, they were allowed to skip questions. So if there was a question about something that didn't happen in the video, they didn't have to answer it or make a guess, okay? Now, what happened when we go and test their memory later? Well, when quizzed about the video a week later, the first group, the condition 1 group, the subjects, they were more likely to think the false event was in the original videotape. In other words, they started to remember that thing happening in the videotape. So they remembered it more compared to those who hadn't been forced to guess, the condition 2 group. So they had inserted a memory for something they didn't actually see, simply from being made to answer questions and make a guess about such an event. Say it happened, and eventually you're going to think it did happen. Anyway, that's a good place to end this topic and our tour of how memory works. It is not a camera or a videotape or an audio recording. It is not perfect, it's not complete, and it's not immutable. It is a complex jumble of different systems, all based on a super complicated and ever-changing mega network of neurons that work just well enough to construct some mostly accurate enough memories to get us through our mammalian lives, not with photographic accuracy, but good enough for most of our purposes if we at least retain a little humility about our own abilities and don't get too overconfident in the stories that our brain tells itself.